Good morning and welcome everyone welcome back to the Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum. Today we'd like to talk about the Naturenomics Civilization, which is really the product of the kind of conversations we've had, which Ranjit has been leading with the previous panel, talking about naturenomics, bringing in interdisciplinary perspectives. So what we're really seeing right now is a world where we're at the culmination of centuries of extractionism and growth, which is consumption-centered. It's not really growth that is sustainable, and we're reaching a tipping point right now. I think there's a global consensus that we're at a crisis, and that's where we come to, and the part of this crisis is the result of this conflicting tension between biodiversity needs and human aspirations. It's not a natural, a pre-existing assumption. It's a constructed assumption. And we have millions of people living next to forests, but some of them they don't have sustainable relationships with forests. Some of them live in interdependency with the forests. They have symbiotic relationships with the forests. The forests grow, people grow, communities thrive. And that's where we started developing the naturenomics perspective from. We brought in anthropology, which was really looking at these forest fringe communities, the ones who live in symbiotic relationships with forests, and looking at how can we use these different knowledge systems to securitize what we call our natural assets, which Ranjit talked about, which is land and water, waste, air, carbon, energy. And that's where we get the naturenomics perspective, which is about putting ecology back in economy. And I think Saurav will now tell you about how we think about it.
It's been a few years since we've been working on developing the principles of naturenomics, and it was about time, say 3 to 4 years ago, to actually put these principles into action. So Rural Futures symbolizes the framework through which we actually implement the naturenomics principles on the ground. We've been working on 2 such pilots, and we're actually launching 2 others very soon. And Rural Futures sets the framework for using forest assets for delivering a system of universal basic assets for the forest fringe communities. Rural Futures leads to the Naturenomics Civilization, which we believe is this synthesis of the best elements from all the previous sort of 500,000 years of history. We have already implemented programs in the Assam-Bhutan border areas and the Assam-Arunachal border areas, but I think a long-term goal for the Naturenomics Civilization really is to work with a lot of our partners who are in this room today and establish the Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum from the snow line of South China till the sea line of Bangladesh. So central to building rural futures and central to the framework really is the restoration of habitats. And we've actually discussed that this morning with Dr. A.M. Singh, and Ranjit spoke about it. And the way we see we can best do habitat restoration is by working with the local communities and the people who are actually the stalwarts of the natural capital. So we embark on community-led habitat restoration projects with a scientific focus on increasing the yield of land. So we focus on endemic species, but also increasing the per hectare worth of land. This leads to revenue generation over years, and we've actually calculated revenues that I'll speak about in a while. And this revenue provides for a system of delivering universal basic assets for these forest fringe communities. What is very essential to keep all of this going and for the sustainability is building local capacities in people and building knowledge and skill sets. This leads to the creation of sustainable businesses which are dependent on forest resources, which leads to a further stream of revenue to create what we call a positive feedback loop, which adds on to community-led habitat restoration. So this whole loop is actually self-propelling in the future, where you initiate with habitat restoration and it can actually keep going over the years. So this process really begins by identifying land that has been degraded, but more essentially land with a high human population or an increasing human population, which is pretty much everywhere in the Eastern Himalayas now. We work with the local people for the enhancement of nature capital, starting from seed collection to building nurseries to afforestation projects, and create a system of initial economic mobility to drive conservation incentive towards the restoration of this habitat. This habitat, in a span of 5 to 10 to 30 years, grows into rural futures village with high nature capital, and this nature capital is used and optimized to deliver a system of universal basic assets and universal basic services for these forest fringes. And we think this is possible, we think we can do this because there are multiple reports which suggest as to what the values of forests are, you know, and studies have been done to measure the worth of forests in India, elsewhere in the world, and these are numbers from certain studies that were done for what is a forest in Assam worth. So 1 hectare of a forest in Assam is worth about 7 lakhs or 0.7 million Indian rupees. And if you look at the total amount of forest land in Assam and you divide that by the number of people who live in the forest fringes, this nature capital can actually provide a system of constant flow of about 10 million Indian rupees per year for the forest fringes. And this is by optimally using your natural assets, not by using them all at once. By this sort of framework for nature capital optimization and then further liquidation, we believe that we can create a system for creating food security. We'll actually be discussing this at some point during the forum. Delivering safe access to drinking water for the local communities. This is something that we have been working with in the past, and we have Dr. Khurana here who's going to talk about this. And we will also be speaking about how education or building capacity really forms a basic pillar towards driving any kind of lasting change and long-term change. And I think, so if you look at all these social delivery assets, these are sort of assessed on a needs-based system. So we assess what the community needs first and what is really most important for the community at that point in time, and plan systems accordingly for implementation. We believe that our program is in sync with the UN SDGs, but we also feel that the UN SDGs could further be expanded and by talking about the securitization of natural assets, and further really by the optimization of your land, energy, wastewater, air and carbon. So we just propose our own 2 additions to the SDGs, and we can debate this over lunch or dinner, maybe over dinner. And I think that this sort of whole system for expanding nature capital and using nature capital to build your basic needs for life will lead to a people's progression towards nature capital and increase of people's ownership towards their natural assets. This system will not only build nature capital, but will also provide adaptation and mitigation strategies for larger climate change challenges, and will provide for the basic needs of the forest fringes by delivering complete universal basic assets. In addition to this, a system of universal basic income or assets, I think really leads to a redistribution of wealth in that particular local area. And this redistribution of wealth is essential to reducing social inequalities, which are grave at this point in time. And I think ultimately, as a part of the Naturenomics Civilization, what we see that we lead to a sort of a participatory revolution for degrowth and rethinking.
And really the key here at the basis of what we call the Naturenomics Civilization is to have communities that are autonomous, who are completely self-reliant and self-sufficient. Right now, we have communities on the front lines in our forest areas, but they're not really empowered to act in ways where they can really become meaningful stakeholders of land. So how do we do that? We have to empower them, and those are really the tools that we're referring to here, which is you need to build common pool resource management skills among them. There's Eleanor Ostrom wrote about managing the commons, and there are certain negotiation skills and the ways to put into place penalization processes for getting communities to manage resources in a way that the resources are self-regenerating. They support the communities and they're not depleted. And then you have to have rights protections for communities to be able to access natural capital, not just to access it, but to have ownership over it. Because unless you have ownership over it, you won't have that sense of responsibility that this is yours and that your future depends on this. And we also think that you do need technology. Technology is very important for the future. We will need, we all see technology as essentially becoming one of the strong arms of production in the future, because technology is really, you have green technology which grows, which is going to help us build resiliency, and especially when you have climate challenges to face, you have to innovate to meet it. And if communities can build these tools themselves, you can create really responsive tools to very, very hyper-specific contexts. But we also need to change how we invest. We're very focused on investing in the fossil fuel economy, but we need to be thinking about how do we invest in building the natural capital economy of the future. And I think that's where you have people like Yes Bank who are really taking the lead there, but we need to do a lot much more in terms of mainstreaming natural capital values in our economy. Next slide. And that's really where we get to the Naturenomics Civilization here. Autonomous communities, but importantly, we rethink what we mean by the good life, which is buen vivir. And what we focus right now a lot on consumption as the way to live well, but is that really the future? I don't think so, and I don't think we can safely say that it is, given what we're seeing right now all around the world. So the Naturenomics Civilization is based on this idea of public luxury, but private simplicity. So I think that was originally mentioned by George Monbiot. But the idea is that everyone has access to the basic resources for living, but no one is living individually beyond their means. And that's really, I think, where the future is at with the Naturenomics Civilization, because that's how you can have your natural capital, your environment, how you can restore that and preserve that for the future. Thank you.
Thanks. We'd be happy to take maybe one question and then chat later. Yeah.
Saurav, I just wanted to know who owns this land. For example, once this land is converted to a forest, so how do you make sure that this forest remain there continuously? Because you know that there is a tremendous pressure on the forest, existing forest only. So what kind of mechanism do you think will prevent the exploitation of this forest in the future?
So as of now, all the land that we work on is owned by the government and are part of wildlife reserves, but these reserves have sort of been used up over the years, and humans are now living on these reserves. And the framework that we work through is in alignment with the Joint Forest Management Framework of the government, which allows for profit-sharing mechanisms to be established. We understand that the exact details of these profit-sharing mechanisms have not been worked out, but we know that there are people in Delhi, but also in Guwahati, who are thinking about what these profit-sharing mechanisms would be. I mean, we recommend at least a 50-50 profit sharing or a larger shift towards community profits, provided that this land is managed by them and they live on this land. So, but I think ultimately, really, we look at a system which might be an idealistic system, but we look at a system where we can prove that land is better managed if the community owns the land. So if you look at forestry across the northeastern states, some of the areas of the Northeast which are most heavily deforested or have been most heavily deforested in the last 20 years are areas where forest land was given over to the government. But some of the areas which are protected are still community owned, right? So I think programs such as these and working along with the government, which is what we've been doing through the Joint Forest Management programs and really getting into talking about who owns the land and what will be the exact profits, because the JFMC policy still does not dictate what the actual profit-sharing mechanism will be. But 50-50 is what they're saying. Thanks.